Well, everyone, welcome back to a very exciting episode of the Storybox podcast. Today, my friends, this conversation is finally happening after me having to reschedule several times. So my guest is very patient with me. So you're going to have to thank him more than I'm thanking him. But his name is Scott H. Young. He is a writer who undertakes interesting self-education projects, such as, get this, attempting to learn MIT's 4-year computer science curriculum in 12 months. Scott, do you still know everything from that course? Just curious.
I think it's probably pretty similar to the amount that we retain from like university in general. So I don't claim that I have like some super memory for it, but I think I probably remember about as much as my undergrad business education.
Wow. Okay. Well, you've also learned, we'll get into that in just a moment, but you've also learned 4 languages in 1 year. I barely struggle with English, but that's neither here or there. You also have a brand new best-selling book, which is called Ultra Learning. People can go and get a copy of that wherever books are sold too. Scott, man, can I welcome you so much to the Storybox podcast today?
Oh yeah, it's great to be here.
It's great to have you here, my friend. My very first question for you is, what does success look like for you?
Yeah, I think I've always really defined my own success in terms of like personal autonomy. I know some people really like they aspire for like wealth or fame or having people really like them. But to me, it's always been, can I like work on stuff that I find interesting and do the things that I want to do? And so I've really geared my life around that to a large extent, as you can see by the weird projects that I do and stuff. And so in that, I guess, limited sense, I have been successful. And I think that that's also a little bit more of a fulfilling definition. I think sometimes you meet people who they really have this eye on reaching some level of like external validation for their life. And they're often disappointed when they actually get it, if they manage to. So, I'm not going to judge anyone else's life choices, but that's just how I've done mine.
When was the moment for you that you realized that was in fact success? Has it been this gradual thing over the course of your life, or was there more of a catalyst moment somewhere?
No. I think it was from the get-go. I mean, I feel like some of that's also my upbringing. I think my parents were very, they had very kind of humble aspirations. So I think that idea of like, you should try to have like a nice life, but not trying to be super ostentatious, and that wasn't drilled into me. So I think that was part of it. But I think, just from the very beginning, this idea of like being able to pursue things that, I'd like to spend time on this. I think this is interesting. That's always been very central to me. So again, maybe we're talking about my personality here. Maybe we're not even talking about like some kind of explicit value choice. This is just, let's just psychoanalyze me now and figure out what makes me tick. And I definitely think that desire to just, work on things that I find interesting and to be able to have like the freedom to do that. Because I think most of us, we're always being constrained by one thing or another. We've got to pay the bills and we've got friends and family and all these other things that keep us from having that autonomy. So it's no small thing to be able to do that. And so I'm very grateful for that.
So your interest in learning, was that more, because I'm curious, is it more part of your own personality, or was your parents encouraging you and teaching you or basically saying to you, learn this and learn that, Well,
both my parents were elementary school teachers. So, read into that, whatever you'd like. I don't think they were not very pushy about it though. So I think that's another thing. Like I definitely didn't have some kind of, extremely, ambitious, like I'm going to make my son the next Mozart kind of parenting strategy. It was just very much learning was sort of for its own reward and for its own sake. And I think, when you grow up in a household where your parents are teachers, there is a certain academic, penetration of that sort of idea in the environment. But I don't think there was a lot of pressure for them to do that, which maybe also made me more interested in it intrinsically too. I think sometimes kids, if they have like really overbearing parents, it can go both ways. Sometimes you can be really grateful that your parents pushed you, and other times you can just be like, I'm so sick of this, I'm never doing this again. Like they study really, really hard and then they're like never pick up a book again because they're just it just left that bad taste in their mouth. So it never was like that for me. So we read a lot and I was interested in things. But if you're asking like why I'm doing what I'm doing right now, I think probably more of those influences happen in kind of my late adolescence or university years, where I got interested in entrepreneurship and I got kind of connected into this nascent kind of blogging community where people do this sort of challenge blogging, where they would be like doing weird things and then documenting as they were doing it. And I just thought that was really cool. And so I think sort of my own interest in learning developed out of this. There's also like these people doing weird learning projects is sort of on the outside of the normal educational system. And I think that really kind of, again, going back to my love of it, personal autonomy, that also had some interest for me because it was this kind of cool DIY thing that people were doing. I'm using cool maybe a little liberally, maybe I shouldn't stress that too much, but it was interesting for me.
Did you always see yourself being, I guess, an ultra learner, or what is ultra learning?
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, I don't know. I think even just like, it's not really a good word to call yourself, right? Like it's a little arrogant, right? I use the word because it wasn't my word. Cal Newport, as some of you may know, wrote the book Deep Work. I wrote a guest post on his blog, and as is typical when you write posts for other publications, they retitled it, and it was about my MIT challenge. And so he came up with this ultra learning word, and I liked it because it seemed to capture this kind of flavor of this sort of intensity. And I liked that kind of, there's already people talking about like learning, but it was often in this sort of guise of, like how to avoid studying or low effort or this kind of thing. And so the ultra, to me, the connection was with like ultra marathons, where it's like, these people are crazy, but they're kind of interesting. I want to learn from them. So I would kind of wanted to extend that metaphor with this book. So while I feel a little uncomfortable calling myself an ultra learner, despite titling the book that, I think I've always been interested in the aggressive sort of learning things and sort of trying to break down the mechanism of like, how would you get good at this in a shorter period of time, or what would be the most efficient way to learn this? And so those interests, I think, have always been there, even if they didn't come under that label.
Have you struggled at all with learning anything?
Yeah, some things I have for sure. I mean, I think the challenges that I do are often self-selected in areas where it's like, okay, not only do I think I have some sort of interesting idea that you could pursue, but I also feel like I have some talent for this that I could go, because I think you probably to do things on that level where it's interesting to a public audience, you probably need both a really good method and also talent. Like they're both required. But I mean, in my own personal life, there's definitely been things that I've struggled with learning. I remember my first experience learning French. So, prior to learning these other languages. And the situation was that I went there and I did a little bit of practice beforehand. And I guess I kind of impressed the teacher. And so they put me in a class. You're just like, okay, you're going to be in this class right now. But I was the worst person in the class. And so like, whenever I would like stand up and, have to give presentation stuff, I would get the like, tisk, like, what are you doing wrong about what you're just saying? And I'm like, I don't know. And so that I definitely, in that experience, I definitely got the feeling of like, oh yeah, this is what it's like to be the worst person in the class. And like, I've learned other things, which I'm not particularly talented in. Like I took salsa dancing up a little while ago. I'm definitely not like a super rhythmic person. And so, my wife is like much better than I am at it. And so it's definitely something that, you get in situations where I'm trying to learn something, but I think that idea of like when you're learning something and you're struggling with it is when you really get down to like, okay, what is the mechanism? Like, how does it actually work? Because when it's all breezy and you don't have to worry about it at all, then you don't have to think about it. So I think that's one reason I like these challenges, is because either through focusing on something that you're not particularly good at, or focusing on something that like just the constraints of the project make it very intense, you really kind of like, it's this crucible of like really boiling down what works. Whereas if it's just like, I'm just sort of learning this over years and I'm sort of getting good at it. Well, like you don't know what the active ingredients are.
I feel you, man, with the trying to learn how to dance. I dated two Latinas in the past, and both of them can teach me how to dance. So we both sort of realized, hang on a minute, Jay doesn't have a rhythmic bone in his body. As much as I would have loved to have had it. And same with the ability to sing. I can't sing or hold a tune to save my life. And that would be contradictory because scientists actually said everyone can learn how to sing. But believe me, I've tried and it doesn't work for me.
Well, and I mean, I think life is short and you only have a certain amount of time to focus on things. And so the goal is not to pick whatever you're really bad at and spend lots of time doing it. I mean, everyone kind of implicitly does this. I tend to advocate a little bit more of a broader view because sometimes you have to do things that you're not that good at, in which case it really makes sense to, okay, I haven't been good at this in the past, but I have to do it for my work or for something that's important. Thinking about the sort of learning process is very important there. And then other times it's just simply, this is something that even if you are good at it, you want to reach a new level at it. I think about that in terms of writing. I don't think that I'm a bad writer in any sense, but trying to get better at writing it's not easy. And so I think that's a big reason to focus on this analysis, I guess you could say, of how learning works and what are the ingredients, and you trying to push maybe past some of the kind of, you just do it a while and you get better at it. That level of analysis, if you can break it down a little bit more, you can often find out things. You're like, okay, this is what's missing. This is why I'm not progressing or what have you.
I guess for both of us, if we see it as sort of like a challenge, then we kind of have that desire to want to do it. I don't know about you. Like I wanted to learn how to dance. I just failed at it miserably, and then figured out, okay, I know this is going to be a challenge for me. I'm going to give it a go. But then if I can't learn and I've tried my absolute best and I know I've tried my absolute best, then I think it's best that I spend my time doing something else that I might actually be better at and might actually be a challenge nonetheless too. But it might be worth more of my time doing that thing. If that made sense.
Yeah. I mean, I think how you pick the projects you work on is a kind of somewhat mysterious project, but it's really important too. And so I definitely think there's nothing wrong with saying, you know what, I'm not particularly talented in this, so I don't want to focus my efforts here. But at the same time, I think, one of the things that we face is that we often get in situations where it's sort of like, okay, I need to do this. I need to, pass this exam to do the job that I want to do, or I need to get good at this skill that, I'm a little bit afraid, or I have some confidence issues or some self-doubt or this kind of thing. And so I think this is really where applying that analysis is often very helpful, and I like to think about it too, because I think if you can often bring the challenge up a level, sometimes students will write to me and they'll be studying something that's intrinsically not very interesting for them, but they have to do it for whatever reason. And one of the things that I really like to do in that situation is sometimes the material is not super fascinating, but there's the kind of higher order puzzle of what would be the efficient way to do this? So I remember I talked to a guy who was studying marine navigation. So he was going to be a pilot for those big commercial ships. And what you had to do is you had to basically memorize just thousands of charts. And I live on the west coast of Canada. And so it's all these fjords and millions of little rocks and points. And basically you'd have to have basically Google Maps in your brain. And this is something that people study for years and they don't pass the exam and this kind of thing. Now, I don't think getting Google Maps in your brain is necessarily a super exciting task. But there's definitely a puzzle element of what would be the right way to study this, right? And so we were sort of talking about flashcard systems and how you would test it and this kind of thing. And so I think that's very interesting because I feel one of the ways that you would approach that often is, oh man, this is just such a demanding memory task. How do you do it effectively? And I mean, this is one of the reasons I really liked learning Mandarin Chinese is because the characters is just so complicated that it just becomes this puzzle of how do you get this information into your brain? And there's other puzzles with physics or things like this where just the material is really complicated. And so the difficulty or the nature of the learning task itself becomes kind of interesting, even irrespective of what you think of the content.
It's interesting as well because I don't know if you've looked into this much, but yeah. I guess you can call them prodigies in a way. Things just come super easy to them, all the content, everything. And it's just for us, it might not come as easy. Like I remember, for example, when I was in year 7, bringing up the Mandarin side of things, I was learning Mandarin in year 7 and really, really struggling at it. Meanwhile, some of my friends, they weren't necessarily prodigies, but they understood it a lot better and they could do it a lot better than what I could, even though I was trying my absolute hardest to figure this out, but it just wasn't clicking in my brain. So I guess for that respect, what do you think is going on for them? Like, is it, even if it doesn't really interest them, right? Like they're just good at it.
Well, I think there is some definitely, like we're talking about this again, talent is definitely a factor. I think if you look at all the research on intelligence and its roles on performance in various ways, I think it's really hard to look at that research and to say that there's no natural differences in learning ability between people. I know some people have made that claim, but it just seems implausible based on all the data that we have. But at the same time, I think there's a lot of factors that kind of go underappreciated. So one of them is simply prior knowledge. So I have this story I like to tell where I know this woman, and she has a master's in it's like some kind of fluid engineering. That's not a real term, but basically she works with like hydroelectric dams. It's like fluid flows and stuff. And this is like really complicated calculus that you have to master for like, all the movement of the water. Like clearly I know a lot about it. So I'm talking about this. And I remember talking to her about this, and she was saying to me that she took an intro programming class at university, like the one that they do for first years. And she took the class and she was like, oh, I just wasn't smart enough for that. And I dropped out. That's totally insane. Like, I think, if you've done, like, given that she succeeded in the masters of complex physical engineering, it's clear that she had the intellectual ability to do the programming class. Now, my little psychoanalysis or my interpretation of that event is that she goes into that class. She doesn't have prior programming experience. Who else is in the class? Bunch of nerdy guys from high school that were coding in their basement for a couple of years. So everything is already familiar to them. Or even if it's not, entirely old knowledge, like maybe if they're learning some new things, they know lots of stuff about computers. And so when they teach new facts, they just hook into all that prior knowledge they already have. And it becomes easy to remember and it becomes easy to retain. And certain answers just seem obvious, whereas they weren't for her. They were new. And so her interpretation was one of general ability, that I'm not smart enough to learn this. I don't have a talent for this. But it seems to me from an outside point of view that the more natural explanation is that, no, you were just in a kind of a bad comparative situation in your class. Another example is, I was just talking about my French experience. Well, I was at the bottom of my class, but it wasn't because I was the worst possible person in French. It was because I didn't have that much French experience, and everyone else I was with were like, Europeans who had done like 3 or 4 years of it in school. And so when I'm the dumb kid in the class because I don't understand a rule, it's because I was never taught it, or I don't, I was taught it like badly years ago and I don't remember it. Whereas for other kids, it was drilled repeatedly. And so these kind of differences in prior experience make a huge difference. And so I don't want to discount the role of talent, but I think occasionally we sort of default to it as a sort of catch-all kind of category. I wasn't good at this, therefore talent was the problem. And I mean, maybe if you don't really care about the subject, you don't want to drill into it further, that's fine. But I think there's just not that much you can do with that as an explanation. Whereas I think differences in prior knowledge can make a huge difference. Differences in, we were talking about studying technique as well. That can also make a huge difference. If you're spending a lot of times doing just sort of reviewing your notes over and over again, rather than doing active practice, terms of how much time you invest, you can get much better results with the latter than the former. So these things also make a big difference in your learning ability. So I don't want to go to the extreme position and sort of just say, yeah, you know what, everyone's equal and you were just not studying hard enough. Like that's probably not true. But I think at the same time, it's often not obvious what prior experiences people bring to things. And so you can spend a lot of time thinking, oh, I'm not very smart because they're doing it really well. And you don't realize what other experiences they're bringing to it. I given those 2 examples, but there's numerous others that I could talk about.
It just makes me wonder what is really intelligence anyway, like these days.
Yeah.
Is it more book smarts or is it like actual common sense? Like which one do you think, in your own opinion, is it both? Is it more than one?
Well, I mean, I think intelligence, if we're intelligence, if we're going to like go textbook definition, is just the ability to solve hard problems, or ability to think flexibly about things. And I think that one of the factors that influences intelligence is probably just based on how your brain is set up. And I think, that there might be neurological factors that make, some people have a little bit better spatial reasoning or a little bit larger working memory capacity, and that those things that are kind of like built into your brain make certain types of tasks easier. But a major factor is, as I said, it was just this idea of prior knowledge, because, when you learn new things, what you are able to extract from the situation is very much dependent on what you already know. If you don't have certain knowledge already in your head, then you're having to assemble it on the fly. Whereas if you already know some things, then you can just grab patterns from what you're learning right off the bat. And so I think the idea here, and the idea that I would want to promote, is that while there is probably an element of intelligence that's roughly fixed, there's a huge amount of it that is just from learning. So you get smarter by learning things, right? And so that's why I really try to promote this idea in the book that, if you are actively engaged in your own self-improvement, whether that's academic subjects or practical subjects, you're building up that base of knowledge that you can, reason about things that are similar more easily.
I love how everyone is unique in their ability to learn different things. They're all at different levels, and how they learn too. Like, for me, I'm visual and auditory and a little bit of kinesthetic as well. So I've got to be out in nature, listening to something, and then being able to picture it in my brain. Like, that's for me to be able to retain it. That's how I learn. But is there any one, this is maybe a dumb question, but is there any one style or way of learning that is, I guess, the best form, or is all styles equally great?
Well, I mean, the research on learning styles, what you're talking about, where there's auditory, visual, kinesthetic, actually doesn't really support that much the idea that people need to have information in their kind of preferred modality. It seems to be the case that there's certain kinds of information that's better presented visually, and certain kinds of information that needs to be presented auditorily, and you need to learn both. So if you're learning a map, for instance, you have to look at it. If you're learning how to like swing a baseball, you need to do it physically. If you're a baseball bat, if you're learning to pronounce something in a foreign language, then you got to be able to articulate, and you got to be able to listen to it. And I think those things are very important. One of the things that I think can be a factor is if you are sort of lacking some of the skills. So for instance, if your reading ability isn't that high, right, then it adds cognitive load when you're actually trying to read a text that's about something. And so basically you have two levels of difficulty. You have the difficulty of reading, and then the difficulty of whatever subject you're learning. Whereas the person who is a very fluent reader, they just have the latter. And so they have more space to learn the new material. So this is one reason why like investing in things like basic reading, and if you're doing quantitative subjects like basic math and things like that, can be helpful. But even physical skills and stuff, I think, are probably operate on a similar basis. We all know people that like, they have a good foundation in lots of different sports. And so they can pick up new sports fairly easily because they have this kind of basic, bodily literacy. Maybe that's not the right word, but this kind of basic set of skills. And similarly, I know people who, they have a lot of musical training, and so they can easily pick up new instruments and do this kind of stuff because they have that foundation. So I think that's one thing to try to invest in if you want to learn skills, and also to recognize, like, again, going to this prior knowledge thing, that like, if you don't have that foundation, then just like, give yourself a little bit more time, and don't just immediately blame yourself for not being intelligent enough. You're like, okay, I need to build this foundation that maybe other people have, but once I get the foundation, then I should be okay.
How does age play a factor in how we learn?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I actually did a piece where I reviewed some of the literature on aging and intelligence. And so two concepts that are important here is the idea of fluid intelligence and crystallized intelligence. So fluid intelligence is sort of your ability to just solve problems that don't use any of your world knowledge. So it's just like, this is just a puzzle. You've never seen it before. Solve it, right? And if you have to manipulate things in your head to figure it out, like that would be fluid intelligence. And crystallized intelligence would be, things about the world, right? And so what they find is that fluid intelligence probably peaks in your like early 20s, but it declines very slowly. So while, if you're 40, you're probably have slightly less fluid intelligence that you did when you were 21. It's not the gap that people think it is. It's not like you're super smart and then you're not smart at all by the time you're middle-aged. That's not true at all. It does show a steeper decline in your like later years. So like 65 and beyond, you can start to have a decline. But even then, there's a lot of variability. It might be linked to health things. People go a little bit senile and stuff, and it can be related to, physical problems with your body. Whereas crystallized intelligence keeps going up. So in that sense, that's the kind of what I was talking about with related to this prior knowledge. Like as you learn more and more about the world, you do get smarter in a way, maybe not the same way as being able to like solve just some puzzle that you've never seen before, but in the kind of practical world knowledge, yourself, the world around you, lots of things about the world, you have lots of life experiences to draw. And those things are important, and they're an important aspect of learning. So I think, that's why, historians tend to peak much later than mathematicians, because to be a great historian is to have a huge amount of history knowledge, whereas to be a great mathematician is maybe to be able to solve some like super specific puzzle where you can like eliminate most of the knowledge of the world because only a very small of it's going to be relevant.
This may be just my curiosity running wild here, and it could be another dumb question, but we'll see how we go. But do you think it's actually possible to stop learning?
To stop learning?
Yeah, to stop learning just straight away. Are we always learning something?
Well, I mean, if we're taking the psychologist's definition of learning, which would be like relatively permanent changes in your brain from experience that are somewhat adaptive, then yeah, of course we're always learning because you can remember things, right? So whenever to stop learning would be to like stop having any memories.
Yeah.
Right? Even people who are amnesiacs, like even, I don't know if you've seen the movie Memento.
Yes.
Where so that's based on a real thing called anterograde amnesia. I'm bad at pronouncing words here. But the idea is that when you have damage to the hippocampus, you can't form long-term memories, but you have other skill learning systems. So they've actually managed to I was reading a paper. I don't know whether it was the exact same thing that the guy in Memento had, but it was a person who had this kind of amnesia, maybe not as extreme a form. And she was taught to speak another language because you have this skill system, which is just, it's a different process for learning things. And it takes a lot longer, but it just shows that there is the kind of a bit of a disassociation there. And so there's lots of things that maybe you don't even have conscious awareness of it, but it's a form of learning. This kind of experience of things in life, of this being good, this being bad, and you kind of like learn to like avoid things that are bad and go to things that are good, is also probably has some unconscious elements to it. I mean, the amount that it's unconscious learning is a little bit controversial, but I think that there's definitely multiple systems for learning in the brain. And so the idea that, we could just go on without learning would mean that like our experience of life would stop. And so we're always learning things. I think what I mean when I talk about learning and this kind of stuff is just that we should try, I think, as much as possible to seek out environments and experiences that are going to expand the breadth of things that we experience. Because it's very easy to get into a routine. And then, if you can imagine, life is this big vista that you could explore, you kind of just walk around the same place. And yeah, you are getting new memories, but they're kind of constrained in some little box. And so I think that's the idea of learning, is that you want to broaden the things that you know and the things that you understand so that you can, reason more effectively in bigger situations and have broader life experiences to draw upon.
I think life is just a constant living example of just learning as many new things as we possibly can. And in learning, you grow, you develop. And I think that's ultimately what life is really about: learning new things, making connections with people. Because if you don't learn something new, and you're going to be very boring, first and foremost. And secondly, you're just going to stop existing really in the world. You're just going to be, I guess, alive, but yeah, that's it. It's just going to be very boring and lame.
No, I mean, I think the thing too is that we often create those boxes for ourselves. So it's not even just this is my routine and I do it, but we box ourselves in. So we were talking about some of these beliefs that we have about I can't learn X or I can't do Y. And again, there's not an infinite amount of time. You always have to prioritize. If you have to choose between 40 things you want to learn, you might want to choose things that are more interesting or things that you have more aptitude for. But at the same time, we kind of can create these boundaries where we very much stick into this small, narrow version of ourselves because of these beliefs about what we can learn and what will happen if we try to learn things.
Mm. Leading towards the sort of close of our conversation, I've got a couple more questions for you, Scott, if you don't mind. This has been
no
fascinating conversation. As you can tell, I love learning, so I'm grateful for that. And what are you've written in your book 9 principles, I believe, to help people learn skills quicker. Are you able to share just some for the audience that they can implement in their own life?
I mean, this is a whole other conversation, but I can just summarize some of them briefly. Like the first one I talk about is meta learning. This idea that if you're going to plan some learning project for yourself, you want to first invest in the kind of learning how to learn that subject. So how does it break down into, different components? Like, are you learning facts? Are you learning procedures? Are you learning concepts? What are they? How is it structured? This kind of thing. Making that upfront investment can be huge. I think, especially when you're tackling something difficult and novel, making those investments are big, because if you're not quite sure how you're supposed to get to a point of proficiency, it can be very hard to put in the work to actually get there. So I think that's a big one. I talk about directness. This is this idea of that learning is often acquiring a lot of quite specific patterns. And so we often think about learning in terms of school, in terms of being in a classroom and studying from a book, but it very much often involves this direct practice of actually using the skill in a real situation. And that's often what's missing. We learn vocabulary in the classroom, but we don't practice it in conversations. And the real conversations is often what sustains the skill. I talk about retrieval, which is related to this idea that students frequently mispredict what will actually result in learning. So if you have a chance to study over your notes, what students will do is they'll read it again and again and again, and they'll feel like they're learning a lot. But there's actually studies that show that if they just close the book and try to remember what was in it, they would do much better on later tests. And this is this idea that there can be some cognitive illusions. There's these misperceptions about what results in learning, and retrieval is definitely one of them. So, I mean, those are just a few of the principles, but there's a lot more in the book, and I discuss a lot more of the research and the anecdotal evidence that supports them in the full book.
Kind of is interesting because we didn't really touch on memory and how memory plays a role in learning. And that's a curious aspect for me, because some people's memory is like, you got those people that have photographic memories. I'm jealous of those people. But for me, I don't have that. My younger brother actually has a visual photographic memory. Like anything visual related, he can remember straight away, which I think it's awesome in a sense. But then he struggles with other visual cues and auditory cues and things like that. So yeah, I think memory is interesting. The whole process of learning, all this stuff is fascinating for me. So yeah, thanks for sharing all this.
No problem.
But you have your book, Ultra Learning, which I want to highlight for people to go and get a copy of the book. Why did you write the book in the first place?
Well, I mean, I think I wrote the book because the stories and examples of people who were, as I mentioned kind of in the beginning of the conversation, these people who were doing these sort of weird self-education projects had such a big influence on me. And it was something that, outside of this, like kind of, what I would argue doesn't even exist anymore, this sort of weird blogging community that was, 10 years ago or so. A lot of these stories were not well known. And I think the idea that you could, teach yourself a language, or you could, take a bunch of classes online, or you could do some of these things, I don't think was fully appreciated by most people. And so I wanted to try to share some of those stories because they had such an impact on me. And at the same time, I wanted to take an opportunity to kind of do a little bit of a tour through what we know from science about how learning works well. So the stories, I think, hopefully complement the research about how learning works and how you might be able to learn better, even if you're doing something that's, not nearly as extreme.
What is a skill that you're still trying to learn today?
Lots of skills. I mean, I'm always trying to get better at downhill skiing, Mandarin Chinese. I don't know. Lots.
And what's exciting you for the future, man? Well, what's going on? Are you writing another book or?
Yeah, I'd like to. I'm working on it right now. I'll probably let people know about it when it's a little bit more developed. But I've been trying to do a lot more research on some of the aspects of, we kind of touched on them a little bit here, but some of the emotional aspects of learning things, some of the social aspects, some of the motivational aspects, which I think are super important. I very much focus a lot on the kind of strategies for learning effectively. In ultra learning. But I think, like we were talking about the kind of real world nature, a lot of these skills is that, often what you're dealing with is motivational problems, or you're dealing with issues of, how do you figure out what you should be learning? And I think these are really important.
I, for one, am keen to see what you do next. I think the emotional side of things and what motivates people, it's fascinating. I think diving further into it and giving people more information on it for them to, make sense, I think is needed in today's world. But what do you love the most about yourself, Scott, and your story?
What do I love about myself? No, I mean, I think the thing that I'm very grateful for, maybe I'll frame it that way, is that I kind of got a chance to do something that was a little bit unusual and unique. I feel like it's often difficult to do that. Or to have an opportunity to do that, maybe because, so much of our sort of social forces is kind of enforcing a certain conformity. And so I'm kind of happy that I was not only in a position where I was able to pursue some of these challenges, but also that I, had maybe the kind of useful energy and naivete where I would, pursue them with gusto rather than just pick them apart and be like, no, that's not going to work for this reason. And so I hope that, maybe someone seeing those challenges would pursue things the same way, that would, consider some idea that this is a little crazy, but I'm going to try it anyways.
Done some pretty crazy things from the outside looking in. We didn't touch on your MIT course. You did it was meant to be 4 years, right? You did in 12 months. So my grandfather actually did a 3-year managerial course in 12 months. So he was like I'm good on him of an ultra learner. He did suffer a heart attack at the end of it, but he did it. He did it. So he's got that rep on him.
Wow.
But yeah, he was kind of like my inspiration when it came down to the thing that I wanted to do and set my mind to it, just getting it done and going all for it. But you've done that with a 4-year crazy course. You've learned, I believe, 4 languages in 1 year, which is insane. You've probably done many other things that we don't know about. But yeah, man, like I've really enjoyed this conversation. My final question for you. This is my all-time favorite question. I love asking all my guests at the very end. It is a hypothetical one, but I want you to imagine with me for a moment that you've been able to reach the age of 100. All your friends and your family have decided to put together a film for you of everything you've ever said and everything you've ever done. Don't ask me how in the world they got it all. We'll call them magic for the sake of argument. Yeah. But they've been able to get it and show it to you on your 100th birthday. What do you want that film to say and to show about your life?
Well, I think I would want it to say that I had good relationships with friends and family, and that I worked on things that I thought were important and interesting. And hopefully that, I had some unique experiences in life. I don't think that's a particularly novel answer, but I think it's the one that I'd stick to.
No, it's a good send-off message for people to think about. Scott, man, thank you so much for your time today, for helping me learn more. It's always great. But thank you for joining me today on the Storybox podcast.
Oh, yeah. It's great to be here.